What's going on, guys? It's Simo. So last week I did a video discussing how Yu-Gi-Oh! Has a major new player problem, especially now in 2024, marking the 25th anniversary. And coincidentally, Konami has decided to release a new two-player starter set in hopes of bringing more people into the lovely Yu-Gi-Oh! Trading card game. But was this product actually successful in doing so? Let's talk about it. Now, it shouldn't really be much of a surprise to anyone who already knows how to play Yu-Gi-Oh! That this game has probably the steepest complexity curve of any card game that currently exists on the market. And that's because we're trying to cram 25 years worth of gameplay and mechanics into a singular product. And so I don't really think this is an easy task for any one person or any team of people to attempt to do. And so I'm going to be critical, but at the same time, I'm also understanding and empathetic that this is not easy by any stretch. However, there are even some pretty simple, basic elements that I feel like we're really missing the mark on here with this product, and so I really can't help but be a little bit nitpicky. So let's start at the beginning. What do you get when you first open the two-player starter set? Well, you get two decks. You get a Synchro Focus deck and an Xyz Focus deck, and then you also get a rulebook, comic book sort of follow-along duel where the decks that you were given are already pre-constructed in such a way that you can just open them and immediately begin dueling. Now, for a two-player starter set, are we missing anything else here? Maybe a way to know where to put the cards specifically on the table? Oh, you know, something like a playmat, potentially? A wise man once said, what's one of the most important elements of any game? Well, being able to fucking play it, and if you don't have a layout or any sort of instruction on where cards are supposed to be placed, then already out of the get-go, there's something wrong here. I don't understand how we went backwards on this. Even the newer structure decks come with a playmat. That's like one of the most basic elements for any card game, is to know where the zones are, where cards are supposed to go, and somehow in this two-player starter set, that just seemed to slip their mind. I'm pretty sure in the rulebook that comes with the starter set, it actually doesn't start indicating where cards are supposed to go until like a few pages in. And speaking of the rulebook, let's just get into this because this thing's a mess. Now again, I want to preface this by saying this is a tall ask for anyone who's trying to do this, and I give them credit for going in a different direction than a traditional rulebook where you're just reading how to play, and instead there's a bit of a scripted duel that you can sort of follow along to kind of understand the basics as they sort of build from one element to the next. But I'm sorry, look how much fucking text is on each page of this book. They're gonna spend more time reading the book than they are actually playing the game. And I'm sorry, that immediately is going to just dismiss anyone who wants anything to do with this game, because the fact that they have to read this much for their first time playing the fucking game, who's gonna find that enjoyable? Like, I get it, right? We're starting with the fundamentals of just actually seeing what a monster card is and going off of that by normal summoning and slowly getting into the next thing. And there's 25 years of history that we have to cover here in this singular product. And this may not shock you, but we actually don't cover everything in the starter set. We actually sort of keep it within a scope. In this case, Synchro monsters and Xyz monsters. We didn't get into the other, like, 5 summoning mechanics we have. So I appreciate the idea, but I think the execution here was just way off. Honestly, they may have just been better off including a QR code on a piece of paper and then just said, go to our official YouTube channel and watch this video and play with your cards while following along with this video, because then at least you don't have to read. You can watch what's happening. You can see and identify where cards are supposed to go, what zones they go to, why the players are doing certain things. And I think more people, especially for Yu-Gi-Oh! Or just card games in general, seeing it visually laid out instead of having to read it on text is probably a much better way to go about doing it. It's 2024. We can integrate some technology in our physical product. So we've talked about how there's no playmat. We've talked about how the way to teach people how to play the game is pretty rough. What about the actual decks themselves? How do those stack up? Rough. Very, very rough. So I went ahead and pulled up a visual spoiler for what is included in the 2-player starter set, and I want to go card by card. I might group some together in the interest of time to discuss why I think a card is a good inclusion in the set versus a terrible inclusion in this set. And we're going to start off here with the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 normal monsters that are included in this starter set. Why the fuck are there 8 normal monsters in this product? Now, I'm not saying that a starter product should not contain a single normal monster. In fact, I think including a couple of normal monsters is probably fine because normal monsters are still used in Yu-Gi-Oh! But for the most part, normal monsters don't do much at all. If anything, the 2 normal monsters that I feel are fine to be in a product like this are Spirit of the Harp and Gilgarth. And the reason for that is that Spirit of the Harp is a 2K wall and can show that some monsters have higher defensive values and are worth playing in defense mode to wall up. And Gilgarth is an 1800 normal monster who's just a big guy. So if we're going to create a starter product and we're trying to start at the bare basics of what a normal monster is or what a monster is in general, these cards have no effects. And so I think just having Gilgarth and Spirit of the Harp are perfectly fine. These other 6 monsters, though, I'm sorry, these have no right being here. If anything, the only other card I would accept as a normal monster being in this slot is something like Summon Skull in place of Ally of Justice Clausulus, because 1, it's a DM card. 2, it's a much better tribute than Ally of Justice Clausulus, considering it's 2500 attack versus 23. But in any case, I feel like we don't even need to have Summon Skull in here. There's actually better tribute monsters, which we'll get to later on. So starting off, not very great. Swords of Revealing Light, I think, is a fine card. I will say, I think this is a lot of text for a newer player, but a lot of people may remember Swords of Revealing Light from the anime, and this, for the purposes of a starter set, I feel like is actually quite a strong card. So I'm going to go ahead and ignore that it has a lot of text. I think if this card is introduced a little bit later, then it's probably fine, but I want to give this one a pass. Backup Rider is a fine card. It just gives a monster attack points. That's great. Apprentice Piper, I actually don't like in this set, and the reason for that is I feel like it's just doing too much. It's a flip effect monster that special summons a monster from the hand, and then if it's killed by battle or card effect and sent to the graveyard, you special summon a monster from your hand. I feel like this just does too much for a single card, especially more often than not, Apprentice Piper is going to be using both effects almost like back to back because it'll get flipped, you special summon something, and then it's going to be killed by battle or card effect, and then you special summon something else. I feel like it's just too much for one card. Storming Mirror Force, I think this is a fine card. Super simple. I think the simpler the card reads, the better. Scapegoat, a little bit of a complex card, but similar to Swords, I think it's an anime card, so a lot of people might remember it if they're trying to get into Yu-Gi-Oh! And honestly, it introduces an important mechanic in tokens, which, let's be honest, a lot of trading card games utilize, so you can use the included GOAT tokens when... Oh, wait a minute! No, you can't, because why would a 2-player starter set come with GOAT tokens? Why would it come with the tokens that it's referencing using in the deck? I can't believe it. You're giving people a starter product and not giving them the cards they need in the starter product to play the game. Oh, I'm sorry. They're in the fucking rule book as little tiny pieces of paper you can cut out. Excuse me. Card E is like a fine card. I feel like this could be something better though, but it's kind of like in the middle. I will say one thing I don't like particularly about Card D is that it references main phase 1. And again, since the starter product didn't come with any playmat, and some playmats even were so advanced as to have the phases of play at the top of the mat, you know, for a new player, they may not know what main phase 1 is. And so that could possibly be confusing. I don't know. The more I think about it, I don't think Card D should be in here either. Warrior Returning Alive, I think, is fine, but I feel like if you're going to include a card like this, I feel like the majority of the cards in the deck have to be warriors. So this one, I feel like for the purposes of the scripted duel might be okay, but how many warriors are actually in this deck? 1? There's 1 warrior in the entire deck for Warrior Returning Alive? And it's Elemental Hero Sparkman? Machine Fairy Machine Dragon Beast Fiend Machine, Spellcaster Machine, Wing Beast Fiend Warrior, but it's not level 4 or lower, Fairy Fiend, Fiend, Aqua Machine Fiend. There's 1 fucking warrior for Warrior Return. All right, cut it. One-time passcode, I don't really have an issue with, aside from the fact that they don't include a fucking security token in the deck. DD Crow is an okay card. I feel like there would need to be enough graveyard interaction for Crow to be relevant, but I do like that it shows that cards can be used from the hand instead of just being used on the field or in the graveyard, so I think it actually teaches something important here. Obsessive Oovaloop, I think this card should just not be in here. This is too much text. Visa Starfrost, same thing. I know some people were looking at the 2-player starter set as a way for them to reprint some random cards that were not like extraordinarily expensive, but were kind of pricey, but I don't feel like this is the product to reprint cards that are like in a completely different dimension compared to who this target audience is. This is a product for getting people into the game and teaching them the fundamentals about Yu-Gi-Oh! Visa Starfrost does the exact opposite from all those things. Vanadium Fearless, same thing, cut it, too much text. Barrier Resonator, too situational, cut it. Fisher, great card, 1-for-1 removal. It's not the best 1-for-1 removal, but we'll take it. Mask of Darkness is fine. I much prefer this to the Apprentice Piper card just because it's a flip effect, so it's teaching about flips, but it's also just a lot simpler. Dark Hole, wonderful. Big mass removal card. Every starter deck needs these. Honestly, Raigeki's at 3. They could have probably thrown Raigeki in here. Kunai with Chain, every starter deck needs these. One of the simplest trap cards, especially when it comes to like attack declarations and such. It has 2 different effects you can use. I think this is okay. Mask of the Accursed, I think, teaches a very important element of Yu-Gi-Oh! In that equip cards can be equipped to opponents' monsters as well as your own. And so I actually like that we have both this and Mage Power in here. Again, not that these cards are particularly played that much, but it is important to know that you can equip stuff to your opponent's monsters as well. And this is one of the best cards at doing that for older cards. Magic Cylinder, great card. Mobius the Frost Monarch, fantastic card. Again, we're obviously looking at simple cards here, and so this isn't going to really stand up to modern Yu-Gi-Oh! But compare this to like Summon Skull, right? It's basically the same card. It actually has an effect. It actually shows you that when you tribute summon a card, it has an effect sometimes, and Mobius being one of the best ones because it blows up back row, this is going to make someone who plays this in a starter set feel really good that they summoned it. Card Trooper has a bit more text than I would like, but it realistically only has 2 different effects. It's just the milling and then the draw. And I think this importantly shows how getting cards into the graveyard synergistically can fuel other elements of your deck for the next card here, like Quillbolt Hedgehog, for instance. So I like Card Trooper, like I said, a little bit more text than I would like, but I think it's a good card. In that same line of thinking, I think Quillbolt Hedgehog is fine. I think it's a bit situational because you need to have a tuner on the field in order for it to be really useful. I would have liked to see something probably different here that relies on the graveyard, but again, I think because we're trying to focus on a synchro deck here, it's passable. Dark Resonator, sort of the same thing. It doesn't have the best effect or stats, but it's able to survive 1 attack, and it's a tuner, which again, we're trying to synchro summon, so I think that's okay. Power Frame, I think, is too complicated for a new player to really understand because it just, again, has too much text and has too much going on, so I would cut this. I would also cut White Elephant's Gift because ideally in my version of this deck, there would only be 2 normal monsters, and so you would basically never be able to activate this. Liberty at Last is great. This is basically like a big blowout. It's almost like a Icarus attack by battle, and so I think this card's wonderful. Phantom King Hydride's a little bit difficult to evaluate because, again, we're focusing on like a synchro sort of deck here, and this thing can be treated as a tuner or a non-tuner, and again, it's super simple. It's probably fine. Really like Supply Squad. I think if we're trying to teach people about continuous spells, this is one of like the most simple effects there is, and it's a very strong one because that means the player's going to be drawing more cards, and they're going to want to keep playing because they have more cards to play with. Galaxy Cyclone's also okay. Again, the fact that it has 2 different effects, one when you activate it and then one you can banish it, it shows that cards can be activated from the graveyard, and so I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing, but again, it just does have a little bit of text. And then back to the front. Great card. Target a monster in your graveyard, special summon it in defense position. We could have gone with something like Call of the Haunted to show continuous traps because I think we have not used a continuous trap yet up until this point. So aside from that, I think back to the front is fine. All right, so I've shaved down about half of the cards in the Synchro starter deck. Let's go ahead and talk about the Xyz one. And again, we have the same issue as the first one. There are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 normal monsters. That is 5 normal monsters too many. Again, the only 2 I feel like are actually passable here are La Jin for 1800 attack and Giant Soldier of Stone for 2000 defense. I understand that this is like they're trying to throw Dark Magician in here as well, but this is the Synchro and Xyz 2-player starter set. This is not the Dark Magician Blue Eyes White Dragon starter set. I don't like trade-in in this deck because this is probably only going to be live for a single card, similar to Warrior Returning Alive. In fact, let's go ahead and count. How many level 8s do we have in this deck? I'm going to go ahead and bet 1. And it's Beast King Barbaro. So we have 1 target for trade-in, otherwise this card is dead. I think that is not the correct way to go about this. I feel like if you're going to put a card in a deck like this, it needs to be live as often as possible so that people have more opportunities to play with the cards that are available to them. And this is just not it. Conversely, no entry, change all attack position monsters to defense position, great card. Draining Shield, same thing. Has a different effect, has a little bit more text, but it's super simple to understand. I think this is fine. White Ninja, flip effect, target a defense position monster on the field, destroy it. Great, awesome, teaches flip effects, has decent stats as well, keep it in. Thousand Knives has no right being in this deck. I can understand them wanting to shove a Dark Magician in here just for anime flavor, but similarly to Trade-In, there should not be any card in this product that specifically requires an exact other card to be in play or anywhere for that matter for it to be used, because this should just be Fissure or Smashing Ground or Sakuretsu Armor, a card that is actually 1-for-1 removal but unconditional. I know I discussed earlier when we go back up here to Scapegoat and Swords of Revealing Light being anime cards, and some people might think that Thousand Knives sort of falls into that same category, but I disagree because those 2 cards are generic, where Thousand Knives is super situational. Same thing goes for Cost Down, right? I mean, it might feel cool to discard a card to activate Cost Down than just normal summon your guy, but I feel like that also sort of goes against teaching you how to tribute summon. I guess it teaches you that you can, like, cheat around the mechanic in a way, but again, I feel like if these products were constructed properly, then I feel like this card has no place. Again, even though it's an anime card. Call the Haunted is in the Xyz deck. Okay, that's perfectly fine. You get 1 Call the Haunted and someone gets back to the front. I think Call the Haunted in both might be a little bit better, but you know what? That's okay. Cyber Dragon might be one of the best cards they can include in a product like this because it teaches about special summoning. It's one of the simplest cards ever. It's impactful when it hits the board, so you feel good when you're summoning it, similar to something like Mobius. This card actually does a lot for teaching people about Yu-Gi-Oh! And I love when they have cards like this in here. Great pick. Inversely, this has to be one of the worst picks for a starter set that I could conceivably think of. Now, I understand that they're trying to shove a few cards in here to make it appealing to non-starter players, but I don't feel like that's the way to go about this. This card has no right being in a starter product. This has way too much text, and not to mention, I don't think this is very fun to play against in an environment that's made for beginners, because this is one of those cards that when it hits the field, the person who plays it is going to feel like they're invincible, but the person who's playing against it is going to feel like that this card is broken, that there's no way for them to actually conceivably beat it. I know Eldritch the Golden Lord isn't like an Apocryphort Towers, right? But I think to a new player, this card might feel that way, and so I don't think this card has any right being in this product. I'm not saying Eldritch is a bad card by any stretch of the imagination. I feel like this card is almost too good to be in a product like this. Skill Successor is another, like, multi-purpose card that also teaches that you can use cards from the graveyard. I guess, like, Eldritch does this too, but I feel like Skill Successor does it in a less intimidating way because it's like, you activate it, the monster gains the attack. Cool. Then, except the turn this was sent to the graveyard, you can banish this to make one of your guys big. That's it. It's super simple. I think it's straight to the point. You're not having to decipher what this is. Crane Crane, I feel like, is a good card, especially in an Xyz-focused deck, just because, obviously, if you're able to normal Crane Crane, bring back a 3, and then overlay, that's exactly where you want to be. And so, I think this card's great. Let me just check how many level 3s are in the deck. So there are 3 level 3s. There's the Stone Soldier. There is the, where to go? The Gyroid, which we'll get to, and then the Magical Broker. So more targets than Trade-In and Warrior Returning Alive have. So I think I'd like to see a little bit more, but I think that's passable. Xyz Reborn's a bit hit or miss for me, and the only reason I say that is because this card isn't going to be live very often unless they've already successfully Xyz summoned, and so this card's a bit weird because if they haven't already Xyz summoned, this card really is just a dead card. But if you're like mid-game and they have Xyz summoned once or twice, then this card's gonna just feel amazing. And so this one's a bit tough. It's kind of in the middle for me. Dark Magician Girl, why the fuck is this in here? Again, I know we're trying to cram some of the anime cards in here, but this card has no right being in here. Chiron the Mage is a wonderful card just because it's a good body, it has a decent effect, it's a simple effect, and it's pretty easy for people to understand what this is doing. Magician of Faith, it's the foil to Mask of Darkness. I think this is fine. With Penguin Soldier, we might be getting a bit heavy-handed with all the flip effects, because that puts us at 3 now when you count White Ninja, but it's still a good card, especially when you have a Synchro versus Xyz focus thing going on. Being able to bounce stuff back to the extra deck is actually important to teach players. Mystical Space Typhoon is in here, good. Book of Moon is one of the simplest cards in the game, and honestly, when we're talking about Synchro versus Xyz, I think it's really important to teach players not the fact that you can set these cards face down, but also using Book of Moon defensively to stop them from even attempting those plays in the first place. Great pick. Needle Sealing's kind of cute. I kind of just wish this was Torrential Tribute, if I'm going to be honest, but it's at least a board wipe, so that's fine. Gravity Axe is an okay card. I kind of wish that there was like United We Stand in the Synchro deck just because you're playing the Scapegoats. I think that'd be fun to just juice up one of your guys to make it gigantic, but you know, it is what it is. I like that they at least have an equip card in here. Dark Factory of Mass Production, like I said, I would only have 2 normals in this deck, so I would cut this. Gyroid's like an okay card. It's nice because if you like set it turn 1, your opponent summons 1 monster and attacks it, it's going to survive, and then you contribute it for a monster. So I like cards like this. You know, it's simple. It's not the best card, but it's like, again, it's passable. Swing of Memories is just a Monster Reborn for normal monsters, which sort of begs the question why we just don't play Monster Reborn in these decks. I don't think it's that complicated. It's far superior to Swing of Memories, and I think it's fun that it shows you can like take stuff from your opponent's graveyard. Beast King Barbaros, I don't see an issue with this card as someone who has played Yu-Gi-Oh! Since the beginning, but I feel like if I were to put myself in the shoes of a new player, Barbaros would be a very confusing card because you're taught that monsters with so many stars are meant to be tribute summoned, but then you read this card that it can be normal summoned without tributing, but then it's attacked because 1900, so then you have to keep track of that. I do like it though because it's kind of cool because it teaches you stuff that like, oh, if you discard this to the graveyard or something like that, you can bring it back with Call of the Haunted, and then it has its 3,000 attack points, right? So this one's a bit iffy. It also has like the Tribute 3 monsters to nuke all cards your opponent controls, which feels like a big blowout, and that would feel fun. I suppose this is fine, but I could also see this being a bit complicated because you're learning the rules, and then you're learning about cards that immediately break those rules. Burden of the Mighty is an okay continuous spell. My main issue with this is that it requires tracking of all the attack stats of your opponent's monsters, and when you're not playing in something like Master Duel, especially if you're a new player, you're already overwhelmed with so much information of what you're trying to learn. I think the last thing you really want to do is also keep track of like the stat modifiers, especially when this blanket affects all monsters your opponent controls, compared to like Gravity Axe equipping to a specific monster, so that's a lot easier to keep track of, where Burden of the Mighty is everything. So I actually much prefer Supply Squad as the continuous card because it's like, oh, something was destroyed by battle or card effect? Great, I draw a card. That's literally all it is. Where the fact this has tracking involved, I'm not the biggest fan of this. I honestly feel like both players should just have Supply Squad. Fighting Spirit's just another equipped spell. I think this card's very easy to understand, so I think it's okay. Gagaga Magician, I know this is like an anime card, and I think this card's okay. I think it's cool to show that like monsters can modulate their levels, and especially because we're playing an Xyz focused deck, I think it's cool that this can be whatever level you want it to be in any instance, so that's quite valuable. Conversely, Star Changer, although it can modify any monster where Gagaga Magician just modifies itself, I feel like this card is, again, a little bit too situational, even though the deck is sort of designed to make this more playable. I just don't think this card should be in here. Same thing for like a traffic control. I feel like this should just be like Swords of Revealing Light or something. Night Beam is okay because it's spell and trap removal. That's obviously important in Yu-Gi-Oh! But my issue with this card is that your opponent can't activate the card in response to whatever Night Beam is targeting. I feel like that's just not fun. I think anyone who knows Yu-Gi-Oh, who knows about effects that can't be responded to, Super Poly, you know, floodgates, different things like that, it doesn't make for an interactive experience. And so again, I'm thinking about the emotional reaction that people might have when they're first playing with this product. And it's like, oh, I'm gonna Night Beam your thing. And as someone who's on the receiving end of a Night Beam, you might feel like, well, that's just really unfair that you can do that, and I can't even use the card in response. So I actually much prefer a card like Mystical Space Typhoon because it can sort of teach you how you can use it in the end phase, potentially, to, like, snipe one of your opponent's back row, so it sort of has, like, an effect like Night Beam without it reading that exactly on the card. And I know that's a bit more of an advanced technique, and this is, you know, supposed to be a starter set, but I feel like cards that just say your opponent can't do X in response, just for the purposes of learning, aren't very fun. Star Drawing, again, if we're looking at this in the context of it being an Xyz-focused deck, I think Star Drawing is cool because it can be used as a level 5 or a 4, so it's similar to, like, Gaga Magician in that regard. And then lastly, Magical Broker. I feel like this card just has way too much text on it. It doesn't really do a whole lot, but I still feel like people just aren't going to want to read this much. Fierce Tiger Monghu is actually quite a strong card. My issue is, again, sort of with the tracking thing about opponent's monster, or all monsters rather, losing 500 attack. But I do like that it is essentially a board wipe, and so you're going to feel pretty good if you activate this and just blow up your opponent's entire board. So that's about all I have to say regarding the main deck cards. I want to quickly cover the extra deck cards. So let's start with the Synchros. Stygian Surgeons. I feel like all of these monsters should probably just be generic to keep it simple and to make it so that these monsters can be summoned as often as possible. So the fact that Stygian Surgeons specifically requires a Fiend-type tuner is not maybe the most new player friendly. I think older synchros, your Stardust Dragons and such, would have maybe been a better card to include in here. I think the effect on this card is okay, but I think just the fact that it requires a Fiend tuner specifically makes this a little bit difficult to summon. Like, I'm sure there are better level 5 synchros, but this could have been like an Allied Justice Catastor or a Magical Android, right? They're not like the craziest synchros, but at least they actually are easy to summon, and their effects are also quite simple as well. Coral Dragon, I think, is a wonderful card. Again, it has a little bit more text than I would like, but it's pretty simple. You just discard a card to destroy a card, and then if it goes from field to the grave, you draw a card. Great card. Rampaging Smash Tank Rhino Saber is also generic, but the one thing I don't like about this is just, again, there's so much text on this card, and when you read it, it boils down to it not being a lot going on. I just feel like the less text on these synchros, the easier it is for people to just sort of get their bearings and understand what it is they're doing. Like, you have to put this in perspective. They just learned how to synchro summon, and now you're going to have them read this wall of text on top of it. And speaking of cards with gigantic walls of text, we have the face of the Synchro deck, Mannadium Prime Heart. Now, my first issue is that this requires a light monster to summon, which already means it's more difficult to summon than the fact that it's a level 10 Synchro if you were not going to follow a scripted duel. So that's issue number 1. Issue number 2 is the fact that look how much fucking text is here. You have to understand, people are already overwhelmed with so many different things that they're learning that you're going to have them read this novel in addition to that. And it's like, if they pull it off, that's cool. But I feel like this would have been better off being like Leo, Keeper of the Sacred Tree. It's a level 10 synchro. Funny enough, it has more attack than Prime Heart, but also it just has a super simple effect. And maybe it's not the best effect because it makes it that it can't be targeted by effects, but that also shows that, okay, there are some cards that are immune to things, and it feels good for the person summoning it that this is going to stick around on the field for a while. The main point I'm trying to drive home here is that I don't think this card belongs in a starter set. The Xyz monsters, however, I feel a bit more forgiving because I feel like they're a lot simpler inherently. First of which, I want to commend that all 3 of these, except for Zeus, we'll get to Zeus in a moment, are generic. Emerald requires 2 level 4s, Giga Brilliant requires 2 level 3s, and Castel, guess what, requires 2 level 4s, and I think that is perfect. We've also got some variety here, right? Each of these 3 also require you to detach a material in order to use the effect, so we're teaching about that. And Emerald, you can either draw cards or special summon a monster, and it's cool because we can actually use the second effect sometimes because we do have some normal monsters in here. Giga Brilliant, again, not the biggest fan of tracking stat modifiers when we're already overwhelming people with information, but it's a pretty decent effect. Maybe like Leviathan Dragon would have been a little bit better here because that modifier is only tied to the card itself versus all of your monsters. So that way you know, oh, I detached the material, it's 2,500 attack. That's pretty easy to remember. And when it comes to Castel, I think my only critique with Castel is that it has a little bit more text than I would like, but I like that it has 2 different effects and they require you to detach different numbers of materials. So that gives players choices in how they wish to use the card. This brings us to Zeus. Now, I have mixed feelings about Zeus. First of all, Zeus does not operate like any other Yu-Gi-Oh card does. I don't want to say any other, but there's very few cards that work the way that Zeus does. And don't get me wrong, if someone who's just starting off playing the game actually manages to figure out how to summon Zeus and activates the effect like you're supposed to if you follow the scripted duel, they're going to feel like they have the strongest monster ever printed. And rightfully so, because Zeus, even by modern standards, is still fucking crazy. My issue with Zeus is that it sort of contradicts what it is that we're trying to teach people about Yu-Gi-Oh! From the start, right? Like, it's good because it shows that Yu-Gi-Oh! Is a crazy game where really the rules are there, but the rules can all be broken to some degree, right? But at the same time, people who are just sitting down with this product for the first time have just learned how to overlay 2 4s to summon Daigusto Emerald or Castel the Skyblaster Musketeer, right? So now you're going to go in a completely different direction and say, hey, guess what? Because you attacked with one of those, you don't have to overlay anything. You can just take this Zeus and just slap it on one of your guys, and that's it. Now you can just win the game. And maybe that's not necessarily a bad thing. I feel like if you're lining up Zeus versus Mannadium Primeheart, I feel like if you're not playing the Xyz deck, you're going to kind of feel like you're at a disadvantage comparatively because Zeus just seems like way better than Primeheart does. But I feel like if you're going to add a card like Zeus, I feel like this should be like the zenith of like the most complexity you're going to teach these new players throughout the entire product, right? If you have all the other cards that we've just discussed in this video be simple 1-line effects, maybe at most 2 lines if they're simple enough, then all of a sudden they're starting to pick up everything. And now this is like the big card that has the most text that they have to understand, right? If you have one card like this, I think that might be okay, although I still have a lot of reservations about a card like this simply because there is a lot going on here, right? You have the way to summon it on the card text. You have the effect to wipe the board. You also have the effect that if stuff is destroyed, you can just attach stuff to it. Again, as someone who's played Yu-Gi-Oh! For a while, it doesn't seem that complicated, but I feel like for a new player, Zeus just might be a bit too much. Although, this would be one of the most fun cards to summon to really get someone hooked on playing Yu-Gi-Oh! Comparatively, when you line this card up to something like Mannadium Primeheart, and again, think how much easier it is to summon Zeus compared to Primeheart, right? Zeus, you just need to attack with an Xyz monster, and then bam, it's out on the field. Where Primeheart, you still have to jump through hoops, and yeah, they both have like their respective large payoffs, but I feel like the Zeus player is going to feel way better about their payoff than the Primeheart player. I don't know, though. I still feel like at the end of the day, Zeus seems like too complex of a card to introduce to starter players, right? It just seems like way too much is going on here, even if it would feel really good if they did understand it. I think this is just sort of one of the issues of this product as a whole, is that by trying to introduce some cards that might appeal to some casual or maybe slightly more competitive players of Yu-Gi-Oh!, they're sort of having to make concessions for the starter set element, and that's where you see them having to include stuff like Visas Starfrost and Eldritch and Zeus, where these cards, while yes, again, if you can actually get the players to understand what's going on with them, it might feel wonderful to play with those cards. I feel like they're going to act as a large barrier for a lot of players who really want to get into it. I have to say, though, I still feel like the largest issue still stands with this product in that it's still really difficult to say, hey, pick up this starter set and say that this equates to what regular Yu-Gi-Oh! Is like, because I feel like going from starter set to playing the game regularly and understanding what modern Yu-Gi-Oh! Is like in 2024, the divide is just massive. I will say a card like Zeus does sort of give you a taste of what modern Yu-Gi-Oh! Is like, in that you can like cheat out these extra deck monsters that have these insanely broken effects, right? Like there's plenty of decks that can do different things like that, but I still feel like it's going to be hard unless people just really get a taste of that cardboard crack, that they go from playing something like this to playing like even a rogue strategy in modern Yu-Gi-Oh! But I'll be honest, I don't personally know how to fix that issue with Yu-Gi-Oh! I think this is something that is going to be an issue with Yu-Gi-Oh! For the foreseeable future. As someone who's made YouTube content for the better part of 10 years, I think part of my job has been trying to figure out how to get people into Yu-Gi-Oh! And make it simple enough to understand without overwhelming them, or creating certain content that is broken down in such a way that anyone is able to follow it from ground zero. But that's obviously just how I feel people should learn. I mean, there isn't necessarily a right or a wrong way, but I feel like anyone who didn't grow up watching the show, whether it was DM era, GX, 5Ds, what have you, is going to be at a severe disadvantage just because of how much there is to the Yu-Gi-Oh! Trading card game. One solution I thought of for a product like this is that maybe instead of it being all these piecemeal different cards that are just sort of patched together to form the bones of what a starter set should look like, maybe they have to make them archetype themed. For instance, for the Xyz version of the starter set, what if we picked an archetype like Satellar Knights, right? Satellar Knights aren't exactly the most complex archetype. Each of the Satellar Knights has only one effect on their cards. Deneb searches a Satellar Knight card, Altair resurrects one, Vega gets you an extra special summon, Unuklahai dumps it to the graveyard. They're meant to be used as Xyz fodder to overlay for their powerful Xyz monsters, which, to be fair, do have a lot of text on them, but we could also slowly introduce those, right? Instead of the boss monster being something like Zeus, the boss monster could be a card like Deltaros, right? Deltaros requires 3 Xyz materials and has only a couple of different effects. Granted, there is a sizable chunk of text in the box, but we could still include cards like Daigusto Emerald, like Castel. The Satellar Knights are all warriors, so we can introduce cards like Reinforcement of the Army, the warrior returning alive with more than one target. The Satellar Knights trigger on summon regardless of if they're normal or special summon, so that means we can use cards like Call of the Haunted or Back to the Front to be able to trigger their effects. Satellar Nova Alpha is a counter trap, which this deck is just lacking entirely, or both of these decks are lacking for that matter, so we could introduce a single counter trap to the game, so that way people can get a grasp on that. For the Synchro half of the deck, I feel like that's a really tall ask, because I feel like there aren't really many Synchro decks that are easy for people to just pick up and understand at a beginner level. I can't believe I'm going to say this, I think Black Wings might actually be the answer here, and Black Wings versus Satellar Knight, I'm not exactly sure how that matchup would play out, but Blizzard allows you to resurrect a Black Wing, which then you can synchro into like an Armed Wing potentially, because that's a level 6. Gale is a tuner, and all the cards sort of synergize together because they're all named Black Wing. You can teach about stuff like Black Whirlwind being a continuous spell and how that works to just get you more cards. Bora the Spear pierces, so like you learn about piercing. Shura has a really strong effect. So like, I think there are other ways we could go about a product like this to like sort of also play into the fact that Yu-Gi-Oh! Has now become like an archetype-centric card game, whereas throwing bits and pieces of a deck together like this is sort of reminiscent of like older Yu-Gi-Oh! Or draft Yu-Gi-Oh! And there isn't necessarily anything wrong with that, but I feel like we're sort of misrepresenting what Yu-Gi-Oh! Is nowadays. And I feel like there are just some archetypes, both in the Xyz and the Synchro, and for that matter, even for Ritual and Fusion, if we were going to make a second version of this product, that would allow it to be a bit more successful in really teaching players the fundamentals of how Yu-Gi-Oh! Is supposed to work, especially in today's day and age. Like I said in the beginning, I don't really envy who was assigned this project, because I think this was going to be difficult no matter which way you sliced it. And do I think they did a good job? Not really. If I'm being honest, it almost sort of feels like a half-hearted attempt, just because the fact that there isn't even a playmat in the product, aside from there being 2 playmats, let alone 1, we're missing important cards for the deck, like token cards. I feel like a lot of the cards are just like really situational, too specific, cards that are just gonna feel bad more than feel good. And if you're really trying to get people into your game, you need to give them the best pitch possible, with the constraints that you're dealt. And so it's unfortunate. It's another product where they attempted to make something to be able to stand out to the new players, but I just really don't think it hit the mark. And I'm really not trying to be pessimistic or negative about this, but I feel like we're still lacking a product that I could tell my non-Yu-Gi-Oh! Playing friends or anyone who might be interested in the game, hey, you should pick up this product. I think this is a great tool to teach you how to play the game, because I just don't genuinely feel that way. Yu-Gi-Oh! Might just be one of those games where you really just have to have someone sit down with you and teach you and walk you through the basics of it, because it's a tall hill to climb. There's so much to learn. There's so much to read. There's so much to understand. And even as Yu-Gi-Oh! Players who are probably watching this video right now, you understand that even as people who've played the game for decades, there's still plenty that we're learning as well. Anyway, I've been rambling about the 2-player starter set for long enough. I'm really curious to hear what you guys have to think, so let me know down in the comments, because I'm curious to know if I'm in the minority here. Maybe other people think the product is fine, and maybe I'm being overly critical of it, or maybe you all agree with me and I'm just overthinking it. But I really want to hear what you guys have to think. I'm also curious to know what improvements you would make, aside from the obvious, like including, you know, play mats and different things like that. I'm curious to know what you guys would improve on this product in the future if you were to design your own version of it. So thank you guys so much for watching the video. Be sure to like and subscribe as always, and we'll see you next time.